Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. We're gonna do something pretty heavy today. We're gonna really try to get a grasp on the state of America, and we're gonna use a pretty controversial book as our lens here: "Suicide of a Superpower."
Yeah, I mean, it's this is quite a deep dive. We're going to be looking at some excerpts from the book that really focus on some serious challenges facing the nation, from culture to the economy to our political system.
Yeah, I mean, and what we're really trying to do is, for the listeners, like really understand, like, what is this author's main point? Where does he think America's headed? Because it's pretty bleak.
It is, it is. And you're going to see this theme, this idea that America is, in many ways disintegrating, declining, and really grappling with its own identity.
Yeah. And I mean, right off the bat, the author dives into these like massive cultural divides we have. Like, you can't talk about America today without talking about abortion.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's a perfect example of where the author sees this disintegration happening. You have such drastically opposing views on something so fundamental.
Right. Like literally life and death.
Right.
One side sees it as, ending a human life just completely morally wrong. The other side sees it as like a fundamental right, like bodily autonomy. It's like, how do you even begin to bridge that gap?
And the author really brings home the intensity of this divide. Like he even mentions the assassinations of abortion providers.
Oh, yeah. That's like as extreme as it gets, right? Like that's where the rhetoric and the hatred like actually spills over into violence.
Yeah. And that intensity, that polarization, it's not just with abortion, right? See it with gay marriage too.
Oh, yeah. It's like every issue, every cultural issue becomes this battleground, this like moral battleground.
And it's interesting because what the author's getting at is that we've lost, or at least we're losing, this shared ethical framework, that common ground that maybe we had before.
Yeah. And you see that play out in politics too, right? Like the excerpts talk about the fight over healthcare reform.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, who can forget those town hall meetings? It was
Yeah.
everyone was shouting.
Yeah.
It got so heated.
And that moment when the congressman shouted, "You lie," at President Obama during a speech to Congress. I mean, that was a moment where you just felt like, wow, we are so divided.
It's like we can't even agree on basic facts, let alone, actual policy.
Right. And then the author brings in this guy, Robert Pape, this political scientist, and he ties it all to like America's place in the world.
Yeah, Pape's argument is really interesting. He's basically saying that America's power globally is declining. And part of that is because of this internal stuff, like the Iraq War, our national debt, these trade deficits we keep running.
Yeah, those trade deficits, man, that's a big one in the excerpts. Like, we're talking massive deficits year after year, especially in manufactured goods.
And I mean, what the author's arguing is that this isn't just about numbers. It's about the deindustrialization of America. We used to make things, and now we don't.
Yeah. Like all those factory jobs, they're gone. We're buying everything from China. And that's affecting people's lives.
Yeah.
Wages haven't gone up in years for a lot of people.
And what's interesting is the author argues that a trade deficit in natural resources, that might make sense for a country like us, but this deficit in manufactured goods, that was a choice.
A bad choice.
Well, that's what the author's saying. It's made our economy weaker.
And not just the economy. What about our, national security?
Oh, right. There's that quote from Senator Hollings. It's a little scary, honestly. He basically says we've offshored our defense industry so much that we might not even be able to, fight a war without help from other countries.
I remember that. Like, we need Japan for the flat panel displays, Turkey for helicopter parts. That's wild.
Yeah, and the author ties it back to this whole free trade philosophy. We've been doing this for decades now.
Yeah, but the author's saying, look at guys like Hamilton and Lincoln. They were all about protecting American industry.
Economic patriotism, right? Putting America first when it comes to trade.
And the argument is that, we've abandoned that. And who's benefited? China.
Oh, yeah. And the excerpts talk about how China's not just, sitting on all this money they make from trade. They're using it strategically.
Right. Like, they loaned Venezuela, $20 billion just to get access to their oil.
Exactly. They're playing a long game.
Okay, so another big topic the excerpts cover is the 2008 financial crisis. And man, there's a lot of blame to go around there.
Oh, yeah. The author goes after everyone, the banks, the politicians, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, Wall Street, the rating agencies.
It's like the perfect storm, right? Low interest rates, all these subprime mortgages, the housing bubble pops, boom.
And what the author is saying is that it's not just a financial crisis. It's a moral crisis, like
Mm,
greed, incompetence, a lack of accountability.
yeah. He even calls John Adams, that thing about our Constitution only working for a moral and religious people.
Right. Like the implication is that we've lost something, morally.
And then, of course, there's the national debt, which just exploded after the crisis.
Yeah, the author quotes that Washington Post editorial, the one that says we should be panicking about the debt. And I mean, they're right to be concerned, right? That's a huge burden on future generations.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about faith and values,
Hmm.
because this is another area where the author sees big changes happening in America.
Yeah, the excerpts talk about this decline in Christianity. Like fewer and fewer people are identifying with any denomination.
Right. And the nanteds of people with no religion, they're on the rise. I mean, it's a trend you see across the board in every state.
And what's interesting is the link between religion and politics. The author talks about this God gap, where the less religious are leaning more democratic, and the more religious, the more they go to church, the more they tend to be conservative.
Yeah. Like religion is becoming this dividing line in politics even more than before.
And there's this argument the author makes that's kind of interesting. He says that, like, some religious groups, by focusing so much on political activism, might have actually weakened their faith.
Yeah, it's like the cause becomes more important than the actual beliefs.
Right. And the author connects this to, like, bigger cultural trends, like Tom Wolfe's idea of freedom from religion. Like, maybe this is the next stage of American freedom, but where does it lead?
And he compares us to Britain. Like Theodore Dalrymple, he talks about how Britain declined because of this, like, privatization of morality.
Yeah.
Like everyone just does their own thing, no shared values.
Yeah. And then the author brings up Antonio Gramsci. He was this Italian Marxist, and he talked about cultural revolution.
Cultural revolution.
Yeah, like how you can change society by changing its culture, its values. And the author's saying that's kind of what's happening in America. The Christian moral order is weakening, and that's going to have huge consequences.
Wow. Okay, so another massive change happening in America is demographics. We're becoming a majority-minority country.
Yeah. And the author points out that this isn't the first time we've freaked out about racial change in America. Like, he mentions that book, The Rising Tide of Color, from way back in the 1920s. It's like this fear of being overtaken by, people of color.
I mean, it's understandable, right? Like big demographic shifts, they always cause anxiety.
And you see that in the excerpts. Like, there's this quote from President Obama talking about how our diversity is a strength. And then you have those Portland State students, like, cheering when they hear that white people will soon be a minority. It's like two completely different reactions.
Yeah. And then there's the whole question of assimilation. Like, the author brings up some pretty controversial examples, like Mexican leaders saying that Mexican Americans should be loyal to Mexico.
Yeah. And then there's the data showing that, like, Hispanic immigrants, they assimilate at lower rates than, like, European immigrants. Fewer of them identify as American even after generations.
It's a touchy subject, but it's definitely something the author's concerned about.
And it ties into this idea of tribalism in politics, right? Like, people voting based on race rather than party.
Yeah. Like, the author points out that African Americans vote overwhelmingly Democratic, like consistently. And he says, blood runs thicker than politics.
And then you have affirmative action, preferential treatment based on race. The author brings up those SAT score disparities, which is a whole other debate.
Yeah, it's like, how do you balance diversity with fairness?
And the big question the author's raising is, like, is all this focus on diversity actually hurting national unity? Like, could it be leading to more division, more fragmentation?
Okay, so let's zoom out again and look at the world. Because the author's argument is that America's global power, it's fading.
Yeah. And he ties it back to all the stuff we talked about, the internal weaknesses, the rising power of other countries.
And he's pretty skeptical about our whole global military presence, like all those bases around the world. He's like, what's the point?
Yeah, like, we don't have a clear enemy anymore, like the Soviet Union, and all those bases, they might actually be making us less popular globally.
And then there's this resurgence of nationalism around the world. Like, it's becoming this counterforce to globalism.
Yeah. And Russia's a prime example, right? Like, their whole foreign policy is driven by this idea of national identity.
Okay, so back to the culture war. Because it's still raging, right? Like, the author talks about all these clashes over religion.
Yeah. Like, remember that controversy when Notre Dame invited Obama to speak?
Oh, yeah. And those art exhibitions that some Catholics found offensive.
It's like every little thing becomes this huge battle.
And then you have the sexual revolution, which is still going on, in a way.
Yeah. Like, gay marriage is legal now nationwide, But the author points out that a lot of people still don't agree with it.
And his argument is that, like, the state, the government, is increasingly out of touch with what a lot of Americans believe. It's like they're at war with each other.
Yeah. And he puts it in historical context. Like he talks about the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement. Those were times when people challenged the status quo, too.
And it's interesting what he says about, like, black anger and white anger, like how they're both real, but they're coming from different places.
Okay, so what's the solution? What does the author think we should do?
Well, he basically says we need to rethink everything, like our alliances, our military commitment.
He's like, we need to pull back, focus on ourselves.
Because the real threat, he says, isn't some other country. It's our own debt.
Yeah. Like,
Right.
that's the thing that could really bring us down.
And he lays out this pretty stark choice, like either we voluntarily scale back, get our house in order, or we face a collapse.
Not exactly an optimistic outlook, is it?
No, not at all. So to sum it all up, for our listener, this author, he sees America as a deeply divided nation, struggling economically, facing demographic changes, losing its global power, and in a state of cultural and moral decline.
Yeah. And he really believes that if we don't make some serious changes, we're headed for a pretty bad outcome.
So listener, we've given you a lot to think about today.
Yeah. Like, given all this, what do you think are the most important choices America faces right now?
And what kind of country do you think we'll be in, say, 10, 20 years?
It's a tough question, but it's one we all need to be asking ourselves.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks for listening.